As you will hopefully know by now, if you've seen other episodes, this segment of the podcast is all about wisdom worth sharing from our guests who are living a life that is a story worth retelling. At the end of every interview, I look back as part of the editing process and discover some of the gems that came out during the conversation, and I summarize them here. Firstly, I'm sure you'll agree that the conversation with Lee was wonderful. What an amazingly inspirational lady she is. With her high levels of energy, I just found that to be infectious. I could have listened to her all day. It was literally like she was telling me a story, which isn't always the case in these episodes. Lee has such a passion about writing and editing, a passion for storytelling. She's clearly found her element, and she's living it every day. Something many of us wish we could do. Lee told us that she'd wanted to be a writer since growing up with her storytelling dad, telling stories in the car, not only encouraging her and her siblings to get involved in those stories, but also probably encouraging them to read and disappear into great books. When she had proclaimed she wanted to be a writer at the age of 10 years old, her dad advised her that she needed to get a real job first, something that a young person could have easily taken offense to, sulked about, and lost her enthusiasm for a dream. But she didn't do any of that. She trusted her father, trusted his advice, and followed it without question. And clearly that paid a dividend, because as Lee states, it's not that young people can't write good stories, far from it. But the wisdom that comes from experience, it's that helps achieve a different level of authentic storytelling. And that often comes with years. When the time was right, Lee took the plunge. Now, it wasn't an easy choice. She needed the backup and support of her husband, and let's say, it's fair to say, she needed a nudge from him too. He'd probably had enough of Lee talking about becoming a writer and not actually taking the steps to achieve it. And life's a bit like that, isn't it? When I talked about Lee being in her element, doing something she loves and is clearly good at, we're often not sure what our element is. Maybe fear, which is what Lee writes about, is the thing that prevents us from opening up and admitting to ourselves what our element could be. And in turn, we never obtain the support and backing to help make that decision, to take that plunge. And what are we missing out on? Well, I think as adults, we tend to listen to all the no's we've had across our lives and immediately dismiss the plunge as ridiculous and far-fetched. But that's possibly where happiness lies. Despite being an author, not paying well, Lee feels that her job is the best in the world. So clearly it's not just all about money. On a different note, Lee discussed the topic of representation. I have to say, this got me thinking, not just during the interview, but ever since. I've been somewhat ignorant about this until now, but when Lee spoke of being a child growing up in New Zealand, where there weren't many kids like her with mixed-race parents, she didn't see herself or anyone looking like her anywhere. And that wasn't just in the playground at school. On TV, in books, magazines, papers, anywhere. She wasn't represented. Now, Lee says it's getting much better, of course, these days, but there's still a way to go. This is why it's important for Lee to be recognized and acknowledged as a female Asian horror writer, paving the way for future generations to tell their stories. Another important lesson Lee shared with us was the influence of both her parents in demonstrating a sense of community. They were involved in everything for their own interests, running clubs and the like, as well as those of their children. If there was a need to be on a committee or a working group, or just turning up and volunteering on the day, they were there. This taught Lee that being an active member of the community was important. And she's grown up with these values, and interestingly, it served her well, despite not doing these things for the purpose of seeking a return. And at this point, I was reminded of the interview with Emeritus Professor David McKee, where he talked about his philosophy of giving more than he receives, but that he was finding it hard to achieve. Neither Lee nor David are the kind of people who would ever give in order to receive, far from it. But it seems that the benefits of being willing to give are numerous. Lee became emotional when she described that her reward for being a mentor would have been the biggest thing her father would have been proud of her for, which shows how important serving the community is to Lee and her family. The final point I want to discuss from Lee's interview was the presence of imposter syndrome. As Lee advised, she'd suffered from anxiety and depression for most of her life, but didn't know what it was until her diagnosis when she was 50. Clearly, this plays a role, especially when, as Lee described, writing is the industry of rejection. Despite writing so many books, essays, poems, and being an editor for so many pieces of work, every time Lee sits down to write, she feels like she's an imposter. Who is she to write a novel? It just shows that winning all of those awards certainly hasn't gone to her head, and her humility is still intact. Lee said that this has actually served her to an extent. It helps her keep grounded and also drives her to improve her craft each time she dives into another piece of work. Maybe a little bit of self-doubt is beneficial for all of us in preventing overconfidence creeping in. Despite feeling the way she does, it's not prevented Lee from doing what she loves. It takes courage to overcome anxiety, depression, and keeping a lid on the imposter syndrome, especially in a career where rejection is expected. She's not just persisted, but she's excelled. And maybe overcoming those things were what she needed for her own personal journey, but also to be the very best that she can be. And who knows, it may have helped her become the award-winning author that she is today. Hopefully you've been able to take many insights away from this interview that you can apply to some aspect of your work, life, and legacy. Use it. Share it with others. As I always say, sharing is like teaching, and teaching helps us retain what we've learned and commit to change, which of course is necessary if we are to enhance our own life's work. I hope that you're happy, safe, and successful in all that you do. And remember, live a life that's a story worth retelling. I'm Steve Worsley, and I look forward to seeing you next time on Life's Work, the podcast all about wisdom worth sharing.